I'm a police officer in Suffolk County, Long Island, New York. For those of you who don't know, the majority of Long Island is densely populated. It thins out a little more the further east you go, but for the most part, it's shoulder to shoulder up and down the island. That's not to say it's horrible either. We have a multitude of parks, coastlines, and recreational areas that balance out the tightly packed townships. And it's in one of those nice little parks that this story takes place, Connetquot State Park in Oakdale. 3,400 acres of protected woodland and water. It's one of the premier trout fishing locations on the island and carries a fee just to even get through the gate. Most incidents are handled by the state park agencies, but from time to time we have need to enter the park. And that's what happened the other night. An abandoned car was called in along the side of the road on Sunrise Highway, apparently. It had been sitting there for several hours, and the county has a strict tow policy for abandoned vehicles, being that the major road was so narrow. I just had to go and get some info from the plates and wait for the tow truck. But when I got there, I noticed something odd. The passenger door was halfway open, not something you would have seen from the road. There was a splatter of crimson on the ground next to the door. It looked like blood. The blood wound away from the car in a trail, right up the park's fence line. Right where the blood trail terminated, a huge gash had been ripped open in the chain-link fence, and bits of torn clothing was caught on parts of the fence. I called in the anomaly, but backup would be delayed because of a violent incident that had happened a little way down the road, so I did something foolish and decided to go and investigate on my own. I still didn't know exactly what I was heading into, so I moved as quietly as possible through the park's forest. I knew the river curved close to this portion of the road and hoped that whomever I was looking for hadn't crossed over, or worse. After just a few minutes of movement, I could start to make out the noise of running water and knew that the river was only a few yards away. Then I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned quickly and came face to sight that nearly saw me vomit on the spot. A man stood before me in torn and bloodied clothing. The bottom half of his jaw was missing as if completely torn away. His single remaining eye stared wildly at me. I rushed over to him and caught him just as he collapsed to the ground. I had basic medical response training, but this was well out of what I was capable of tending to. A dozen cuts ran the length of his torso, and a chunk of flesh was missing from his right arm. It was amazing that the man was still alive, let alone walking around. The options racing through my mind were cut short by a bizarre noise coming from the river at my rear. Some kind of inhuman chittering and chattering, like the high-pitched voices of children. Hearing the sound, the man began to tremble uncontrollably, and I lost my grip on him. I heard the noise of his skull splitting open as his head cracked against a rough-edged stone. Caught between the otherworldly noise and the sight of a man's death, I wheeled once again toward the river to see what was next in this nightmare sequence of events. From the banks rose two tall figures, nearly half again the size of a normal man. Their faces were set back in deep obsidian hoods so as not to be seen. Each of their left hands appeared to be human, but their rights extended into foot-long scythe-like blades. Their inane chattering grew louder as they strode toward me, and a sick fear erupted in my stomach. I pulled my firearm from my holster, and without the presence of mind to command them to stop, I fired right at them. The shots seemed to pass right through them, except for the last one, which burst straight through one of the sickly eyes. The creature let out a wild scream, pulling its human hand to its face, while lashing out wildly with its bladed arm. I fired at the other creature just as it burst into motion, bolting towards me. 2 shots, and then a click. I turned and ran. The horror behind me drove me to run haphazardly through the dark forest, and I hoped that I was heading back in the direction I came. I could hear the creature beating the ground behind me, emitting its high-pitched screeching. The pursuit lasted for several minutes until ahead of me I saw a blue and red strobe light. The road was close by and there were other officers there. I ran all the harder and nearly slammed into the chain-link fence. I glanced over my shoulder quickly and couldn't see the thing anywhere, grabbed onto the fence and nearly threw myself over the top of it. The officer must have seen me jumping over because he wheeled his car around right on the road and ran it up onto the shoulder just beside me. It was a man I knew, and once he saw it was me, he called for paramedics and backup. I'll cut out all the follow-up. Long story short, neither the man's body nor either of the creatures was recovered or even seen. The vehicle was still there and the blood trail, but not even canine units could locate anything outside of that. I've been remanded to an intense psychiatric evaluation and placed on paid administrative leave. I've been told that the stress of the job has just caught up to me and that some time off would be good for my mental health, but that's just their polite way of saying I'm crazy and shouldn't be carrying a weapon. I know I'm not crazy. I know that those two things or whatever they were are still out there, and there could even be more. Back when I was a young man, I was a Marine reservist. I had always wanted to contribute and be in the service some way, but I didn't want to be a full-time active-duty Marine. Reservists go through the same type of training, but it's very much a part-time role. I had to commit to serving 1 weekend a month plus 2 weeks a year. But my lifestyle was flexible, and I got to live in my own home and act like a civilian most of the time. Of course, I could be mobilized to active duty if there was ever a national emergency or something like that. I'm not sure how amphibious training is done now, but there was this one weekend where we had to participate in an amphibious landing exercise, and we took an excursion out to a lake in northern Georgia. We were going to be doing some amphibious assault stuff and a training patrol. It was the only time I ever remember doing this type of thing somewhere other than on a military installation. But this time we were using a public lake. It seemed strange to me, and I didn't know how that decision was made. But apparently the local police and residents had been informed, so we supposedly wouldn't be freaking anybody out. This was taking place at around midnight. We arrived at the lake and got loaded up on the Zodiacs, which are inflatable boats. We rowed for about 30 minutes and then stopped and slipped into the water. We swam to our designated spot and stashed our swim gear. Then we outfitted ourselves in our armored vests and other patrolling gear. By then, it was about 1 a.m. We started patrolling toward our objective and realized that we were within sight of some houses off in the distance. We couldn't see the houses clearly, but we could see light coming off of them over the hill. We could hear people having a loud party. The sound of the music was drifting over to us. We were plenty far away, but it was pretty wild to think what a sight we would be if anyone saw us. A 6-man team with our rucksacks and all our gear tramping through the woods. It might be hard to imagine a public lake as being a suitable training spot, but I'm telling you, it was rough going. There were vines growing everywhere, and we kept getting tripped up. We were trying to be quiet, but it's challenging to be groping around in the dark when you're carrying a big sniper rifle. I remember the guy in front of me had a training rocket across the top of his rucksack. For some reason, I kept expecting it to fall on the ground in front of me. It felt surreal out there. There wasn't much moonlight, and the terrain was treacherous. The vines were relentless, and we were making way more noise than we wanted to. We kept going until we were in an isolated tract of woods. We must have been at least a mile from any house or road at that point. We had reached the place where we were going to build our hide site. A hide site is built from whatever you can use in your surroundings. A well-built hide site can provide an incredible place for concealment. Once we got it done to our satisfaction, we settled in. I was sitting up against my rucksack, planning to try to get a little sleep. I was dozing off when I thought I heard feet shuffling through the leaves. I immediately snapped completely awake. Everyone else heard it too. The sound was coming from behind us. I heard this weird flapping noise and had the sense that something had flown up into the black walnut tree about 20 feet away. But that flapping sound was substantial. It wasn't like any ordinary bird or anything. Then, before we knew it, our hide site was being pelted with black walnuts. Who would do such a thing? I mean, we all assumed it had to be some kind of bizarre animal. Everyone started quietly gathering their stuff up in case we had to move away from the area. Our team leader cautiously stuck his head out and shone his flashlight toward the tree. When we heard him gasp, we all froze. I had to see what it was, and when I looked, I couldn't believe it. It was a winged creature, but it had a human-like body and was standing in the tree like some kind of demon. My first thought was that it was someone dressed up in a costume. The black wings were huge, like the whole length of its body. It wasn't close to Halloween yet. My mind was going through all these contortions trying to figure it out. The thing made this weird high-pitched sound and glared at us with its red eyes. I swore it had to be a costume because that sort of thing doesn't exist. This all happened in just a few seconds. I raised my rifle and was about to order it to drop to the ground when it shrieked and flew backwards out of the tree into the dark behind it at like 60 miles per hour. My jaw just dropped. All of us were just stunned. Nothing human could move like that. It was like it was wearing a jetpack or something, but it was completely silent. Honestly, none of us knew how to react to that. None of our hours of training had ever included a vision like that. It seemed supernatural. I'm pretty sure no one rested at all that night. We completed our mission, but we did not really have a feeling of accomplishment. We felt a huge sense of discomfort. We realized how impossible it was to truly be prepared for everything. I was a police officer in the North Woods of Minnesota. Given the area, the number of vehicle collisions with wildlife was quite high. Standard procedure was to make sure the occupants of the vehicle were all accounted for and received proper medical attention, report damages to the vehicle or other property, and dispatch the injured animal if necessary. Now, nobody calls an ambulance when they run over a raccoon, but we have deer, elk, moose, and bear up here that can cause some real damage. The two worst animal collisions I'd ever seen were between a bear and a moose. Just last summer, I was on the scene of a driver who hit a male black bear with a Dodge Ram. The truck was totaled, but luckily the driver survived with few injuries. Moose are probably the worst, especially if you're in a car or a small SUV. More often than not, the vehicle strikes the moose at the knees, and it falls on top and crushes the car. Most people don't survive that. Accidents with white-tailed deer are by far the most common, and they vary from totaling the car to getting away with a scratch or a broken headlight if it's not a direct impact. If I get a call about a vehicle collision with a moose, I know it's most likely going to be bad. If it's a deer, it could be anything. And after what I saw on that cold October night, I do mean it can be anything. I was called, along with an ambulance, about a vehicle collision with a deer. The dispatcher said there was only one occupant in the vehicle, and she was reported to be mostly uninjured. When I got there, I saw it was a teenage girl. She had a few cuts and bruises from the airbag deploying, but seemed medically all right otherwise. She was pretty shaken up, but most people are after a vehicle accident, so I didn't think anything of it at the time. Her vehicle, a newer model SUV, was totaled. The front end was completely smashed in and the front windshield was shattered. The front right tire was barely attached. To be honest, I was surprised the girl didn't have any other injuries. I noticed what looked like bits of muscle tissue and deer hair on the front of her vehicle, or what was left of the front of her vehicle. I didn't see the deer lying anywhere in the ditch, but I didn't imagine it could have survived an impact like that. There was something strange, though. The whole front of the car smelled like decomp. The accident happened only a few moments before, and yet the pieces of deer smelled already rotten. It wasn't the heat from the engine searing the hair either, it was something else. It smelled like something that had been dead for weeks. I was on a wellness check once for an older gentleman who unfortunately passed away before we arrived. The medical examiner gauged him to have been dead at least a week, maybe a week and a half. If you've ever smelled a decomposing body before, it sticks with you. And that's exactly what this smelled like. I looked around in the ditches for some rotten roadkill to explain the stench, but I didn't find anything. I pulled one of the EMTs away and asked if they could smell it too, and they said the scene had smelled like that since they had arrived. The driver looked like she would be okay, and that was the important thing right now. When I talked to her, she didn't appear to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. She overheard me talking to the EMT about the smell and claimed it suddenly came out of nowhere, right before she saw the deer in the road. This particular stretch of road was right at a blind corner, so she didn't see the deer until it was too late. Hit it head-on at 45 miles per hour. When I asked some more questions, she said the deer looked sick. Its fur was long and matted up, longer than a normal deer's fur usually was. She said it was skinny and she could see its bones, literally see its bones. She said it had patches of skin missing and she could see its white rib bones poking out past the muscle. It must have been an already injured deer, probably with gangrene. Most likely had been hit by a vehicle before and suffered some pretty severe damage. It's not a common situation, but it's not unheard of. It was either that or else the deer was suffering from chronic wasting disease. Those theories went right out the window when she described its face. She said it looked like a skull, white with no hair on it at all. It had antlers like an elk and, get this, no eyes. They were just empty black sockets. I started to question whether this girl might actually be on some type of drug because the whole thing sounded insane. I started looking around for the deer. We were surrounded by woods on both sides of the road, but I doubted this thing could have gone far. I didn't even step off the road before I noticed the outline of white antlers among the trees. The girl was right. They looked just like elk antlers, but the animal didn't appear large enough to be an elk. It was looking directly at me, as if it had been watching me the entire time. I couldn't see its face in the shadows of the forest. The smell of decomp grew stronger, and though I didn't know exactly what I was looking at, I knew there was something terribly wrong here. I pointed my flashlight at the woods. I only saw the creature for a second. The girl's description of it was accurate. Its face was a skull. No eyes. Just black holes in its head. Skinny and matted. I shined the light directly at its face. It tilted its head like a dog does when it hears a strange noise, like it was curious. It rustled its antlers in the brush. I thought about shooting it, but if this thing survived that accident, I wasn't sure a gun could take it down, and I didn't want to find out the hard way if I was wrong. I told the EMTs to hurry up and stay inside the ambulance. They must have thought I was crazy. I waited there for the tow truck after the ambulance left. The creature stayed there the entire time, just watching. The only part of it I could see were the outline of its antlers. It kept to the shadows. I put collision with a deer on my report. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't imagine anyone would believe me otherwise. I haven't seen anything like it again, but I've heard other stories from the area that make me think I wasn't crazy that night. I ended up getting lost on a hike in the Arizona desert. The area I was hiking in had several canyons and deep gorges. It was a beautiful location, but the trails weren't very well marked, and I must have got turned around. I didn't get a signal on my phone, so I couldn't use the GPS to pinpoint my location. It was getting dark, and I was almost out of water. The only flashlight I had was the one on my phone, and I didn't want to use it for fear of draining the battery. It wasn't a great situation, but I was afraid it was going to get much worse if I didn't find my way out soon. I wandered around for what must have been another hour with no luck in finding my way to a trail. It was dark by that point, and I was settling into the idea that I would have to spend the night out there with no shelter. I didn't even have a jacket with me since it was so warm during the day, but the desert can get cold at night. Very cold. I know it was stupid of me not to pack at least some basic survival gear, but I didn't, and that was the situation I was in. My biggest worry was the cold and my lack of water. I hadn't even thought about the possibility of wild animals until I heard something moving through some bushes nearby. I used the light on my phone and shined it toward the direction of the sound, and to my delight, I saw another person. I shouted at the person to tell them where I was, and then I started explaining how I ended up lost out here, but I stopped midway through my story because the person wasn't responding to me at all. They were just standing there staring. At that moment, I knew something was weird, but I didn't know what it was yet. I waved my arm and asked if they could hear me. The figure waved back but didn't speak. So now I was not only worried about being cold, lost, and thirsty, but also about being trapped alone in the middle of the desert with a lunatic. I couldn't get a good look at the person from as far away as I was, so I approached them. I tried talking, but they still didn't respond. But they didn't make any attempt to leave either. They just let me approach. When I finally got close enough to see who I was talking to, I about fainted from shock. It wasn't a person at all. It stood like a person. It looked like a person from a distance, but it wasn't like any person I had ever seen. It was covered in dark brown or black hair all over its body, except for its face, feet, and hands. Those were brown or tan colored. Its skin was thick and leathery. Its face looked more like an ape than a person, but its eyes looked human. I screamed when I realized what it was, and then I ran. I didn't know where I was running to. I just wanted to get away from that creature. I was already lost, but I didn't want to get attacked by a monster out here. I don't imagine my body would ever be found if something happened to me. To say I was terrified was an understatement. I ran maybe half a mile into the night, and I thought maybe I was safe. I rested there for a moment. The sky was clear, so I tried to memorize the locations of the stars. Maybe I could use them to navigate my way out of here. I drank the last bit of my water and tried to breathe for a minute, but my moment of calm didn't last. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shape moving towards me. It was the creature. I tried to evade it with no avail. I set out running again, but every time I stopped to catch my breath, it was there. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it couldn't be good. I was nearly exhausted, but it was either run or end up caught by this thing. So I ran. I don't quite remember what happened after that. I'm pretty sure I collapsed from exhaustion coupled with lack of food and water. The next thing I remember was waking up on the ground near the trailhead. It was still dark, but I could see the morning sun peeking over the horizon. I was freezing, but some weeds and shrubbery had been laid over me. I didn't know what to think. I could see my car in the parking lot. It was the only one there. I hurried to get up and get to the car so I could turn on the heat, but as I moved the plants off of me and dusted off my clothes, I noticed footprints in the dirt around where I had been sleeping. The footprints were massive and looked like those of bare human feet. I knew it was that creature. It must have carried me here and put those weeds over me so I wouldn't freeze. I was so afraid of that thing when I first saw it, and here it was only trying to help me. I don't know how I would react if I ever saw another one, but I know the one I did encounter wasn't a monster, and to be honest, I'm thankful it found me out there. I don't know how I get myself into these situations. I mean, I don't even like to go camping. So many times I've tried and I just end up being cold and wet and uncomfortable. Also, I hate to admit it, but I barely know what to do with myself anymore when I don't have an internet connection. But I don't mind renting a cabin on occasion. I've found plenty of them that have electricity and even Wi-Fi sometimes. But I have this loyalty to a couple of my childhood friends, and they love camping. Especially the kind of camping where you have to hike in to get to your spot. So every once in a while I let them talk me into it. They convinced me to go with them during one of our college breaks. Maybe it was because I was the one with the fancy tent. I had inherited it from my brother when he upgraded to an even bigger one. He had 2 kids and a wife, so he needed a lot of room. My friends had their eye on this place in the Great Smoky Mountains. The plan was for a 3-day trip with a lot of hiking in and camping and hiking out. It really was too cold for my liking, but things were going okay the first day. It was a sunny day in spite of the temperature. We did plenty of drinking that first night and had a blast laughing and talking. When I was laying in the tent that night looking up at the stars, it was almost pleasant. But the next morning it was cloudy and kept raining on and off. I was trying to pack up and everything was getting soggy, and I was getting grouchy. If it had been raining steadily, I could probably have convinced the others to shorten the trip. but the sun kept peeking out and pretending like it was going to actually turn into a nice day. The rain turned into a mist that my friends thought was cool and kept saying how it would be fine. But during the afternoon, the temperature really dropped, and I couldn't even pretend to be having fun. I stopped walking and said I wasn't going any further. And since I had the only tent, they could either stay with me or go on without a shelter. We got the tent up and a fire going to dry out our clothes. At least we had more wine to raise our spirits, and the rain was holding off. We were trying to get into a jovial mood, but one of my friends started acting a little weird and nervous, and kept looking off into the woods. It was starting to make me feel nervous too. I asked her what she was looking at, but she just said she felt a little off and kind of creeped out. Well, that didn't help my mood, and I got paranoid. The Great Smoky Mountains are known for having plenty of black bears. I had heard they were mostly harmless, especially if their cubs weren't threatened. I wasn't interested in taking any chances, though, and there were plenty of other things that could be hiding in the woods. We decided that since the weather had been so wet lately, it wasn't likely that anything would catch on fire. So we left the fire burning a little and went into the tent. It still wasn't raining, so we left the tent flap a little unzipped in order to keep an eye on the fire. I was really sleepy though, so I guess I dozed off right away. But it seemed like only a few minutes had gone by, and I jolted out of my sleep and sat straight up. I thought for sure I heard something moving outside the tent. I looked at my friends, and they were wide awake too. We looked out at the glow of the fire. The embers had burned down really low. I was straining my eyes, and I thought I could make out some antlers just outside the tree line. I wanted to feel relief at the thought that it was only a deer. But for some reason, that sight made me feel ice cold to the core of my being. It made absolutely no sense. I had no fear of deer. It looked like it was stepping a little closer toward us, and when I saw the shape emerge, I was horrified. It couldn't be a deer because it was standing upright, and it seemed 7 or 8 feet tall. I wanted to scream or cry, but instead I just shut down. I saw these yellow eyes come glowing out of the darkness, and they seemed to be embedded in the skull of a deer. I had this weird thought that some devil creature had stolen the deer skull and was wearing it for its own evil purposes. There was a terrible smell of rotten flesh that drifted over to us, and we looked at each other like this was the end. When I looked at that thing, it actually seemed like it was dead, like some rotting corpse that was somehow walking around. It looked like it had tattered flesh hanging off of it. But the worst part was how it made me feel hollowed out, and I had the sense that I was possessed with a demonic hunger that could never be appeased. What happened then was so weird. We all spontaneously took hands and closed our eyes and started to pray. Let me tell you, there wasn't one religious bone in any of our bodies. I hadn't been in a church since I was 12 years old. My one friend looked and started describing how she could see a luminous, protective light surrounding our tent. She was sure it was an impenetrable light through that evil could not enter. We must have stayed in that circle together for 20 minutes. And eventually, the desolate feeling withdrew, and everything was back to normal. I don't know what more to say.